Welcome to part 2 of the Sawtooth software webinar scripting series, Perl, an exclusive webinar for suite holders like you. My name is Megan Pites, and I am the Ingenuity Ambassador at Sawtooth Software. I am joined by my colleague Justin Luster, our Lighthouse Studio and Discover Product Manager. Justin knows a thing or two about programming and frequently uses Perl to enhance the products and services we offer. In this webinar, Justin will cover the basic applications of Perl and take us through some demonstrations that will show you how powerful Lighthouse Studio can be when you tap into your programming skills. So Justin, take it away.
So let's talk about Perl, and hope I really hope what I can share with you is going to make you a more powerful Lighthouse programmer, and you'll be able to do more things that you can't do now. You'll have more power going forward. So I'd like to review a little bit about some of these extra technologies you can use to customize and enhance Lighthouse surveys, and kind of give you kind of the big picture of where Perl stands in all of these other technologies. So the example I like to use is to talk about kind of use a home as an example. So you see here, these guys are building a structure to a home, and this is kind of like HTML. The HTML on a web page, the HTML kind of sits behind the scenes, but it sets up what the structure of the web page looks like. CSS, cascading style sheets, that's kind of like the wallpaper in the home or your website, where CSS can make turn on colors and change the shape of things and the position of things, and you could use CSS to do a lot of things on your web page. JavaScript's kind of like a doorbell on a house, where when you click on buttons and do different actions on your website, it will produce different effects. And JavaScript helps you to control kind of that interaction with the web page. jQuery is just more powerful JavaScript. Now here's the slide that matters for today. So we talked about maybe comparing a web page or a website, to a house, and there's the house there on the ground. And what that represents is in your web browser, the web page has been loaded, it's come down from the internet, and it's loaded on your computer, on your web browser, and that's the house. The big heart-shaped cloud up in the sky is my representation of where the Perl code actually runs. This is an important principle to remember, that the Perl code runs up on the servers, up in the cloud. That all happens up on the cloud. And then what happens is it comes up with a result, and it sends that result down to your house, down to your browser. So it figures out all the HTML that it needs to show, and it does all that computing, and it figures out what questions should show on which page. It does all that up in this cloud, and then when it's finally done, it sends that HTML, that CSS, and that JavaScript down to your browser, down to your house. So teaching you a little bit about Perl will allow you to customize kind of what happens up in that cloud, what happens up on the server before it gets delivered to your browser. So hopefully, if you're attending this webinar, you're motivated and you understand that this could be very helpful to help you get better. So let's start by talking about Sawtooth script. Okay, Sawtooth script is a scripting language that we provided to you to be able to use within Lighthouse. So there's a lot of different commands and things that you can do, and you can see all this in the help. Again, highlight this. This is code that will run up on the server before it gets down to your browser. JavaScript, on the other hand, that code runs after the web page loads on your browser. And we've tried to make the Sawtooth script simple. So I'm going to show you an example of what just regular Sawtooth script is. So anywhere in your survey, you can type in, say, bracket %, and then right in here, you can type in Sawtooth script. So you can do, for instance, there's a bunch of functions you can call like question name. And this will display the name of the question back to the screen. Not sure this is going to work in preview mode. It did. So here in preview mode, it will show intro. And intro is the name of my question. So just, anywhere you type in these bracket percent, you can type in Sawtooth script. You could do like 3 plus 5, and we're going to click preview, and we're going to see that that's 8. Okay. There are also other places where we expect script. So, in here we're kind of expecting you to type in just regular text, and then you have to tell us if you want to do a little piece of script by doing this bracket percent stuff. If you go into, say, skip logic, and you click add, when you type in the logic for when to skip, skip if, intro is equal to 5 or something, this is actually Sawtooth script as well, but there's no reason to type the bracket percents because we're expecting script in that box, if that makes sense. Okay, let me delete this. Okay, you might have noticed this, that what happens is this up on the server looks at this code and it looks at this bracket percent and it's like, okay, I need to evaluate this, and then it basically turns this into 8, and then 8 is sent down to your browser. This thing right here is evaluated and replaced with the answer on the way back down to your browser. Okay. Okay, so here's some examples of this Sawtooth scripting language. You can pipe a prior answer and display it. So if you collected Q1 on the prior page and you wanted to show that back to the screen, on the next page you could type in bracket percent Q1 percent bracket, and the answer to the prior page will then just show up on the screen. If you've ever gotten into constructed lists, and again, if you haven't, you should, there's a lot of power with constructed lists. This is the ability to manipulate what, say, response options are shown in a select question on the fly. And notice here I don't have bracket percent because in constructed list logic, we're just expecting you to type in scripting stuff. You don't have to tell us to break into that mode, so you just type in script. Here's another example of, if you can take the answer to Q1 divided by the answer to Q2, and then you can round that. And so it's a lot like Excel. I'm sure many of you have typed in formulas into an Excel cell by typing in equals and then type in some logic. Very similar to that. Okay? Okay, so here's where we start getting into the Perl. Sawtooth script is actually written in Perl behind the scenes. So when you type in something like bracket percent Q1 plus 3, kind of this simple little Sawtooth script, when it gets uploaded to the server, it actually translates into actual Perl code. Now, Perl is a programming language that is not from Sawtooth software. This is a industry programming language that is used by many websites and many applications around the world, kind of like JavaScript. JavaScript, of course, is much more popular right now, but Perl is used out there, and there's websites you can go to learn from it. You can buy books on Perl, etc. Turns out that the back end of Lighthouse Studio, and incidentally Discover, it's all written in Perl. And so this is basically taking users' code and plugging it into the rest of our Perl code. So Q1 plus 3 behind the scenes is translated into a function called value, and then you'll see Q1 inside of double quotes plus 3, and you'll see this semicolon. So a bit more nerdy and complicated, but that's what's happening behind the scenes. Okay, so all Sawtooth script functions that you can use with just Sawtooth script are available in the Perl. So when you start to get into this, you'll notice that the Sawtooth script functions need to be capitalized, and there's a few other rules we'll talk about. So as I said, Perl is a powerful programming language, a powerful scripting language that you can use, and you can actually use it within Lighthouse Studio. So custom Perl code can be used for to do additional flexibility, to have additional power. As I'm said over and over again, because I've had users and clients get confused by this. The Perl code runs up on the server before it gets down to your browser. So we allow you, and we're proud of the fact that we allow you to customize Lighthouse Studio. We allow you to use your own custom Perl code, and we call it unverified Perl. We call it unverified because we can't check your custom code for errors. You just type in your custom code and you're on your own. Okay. So let me show you really quick. We have this example of bracket percent question name, and let's just see if that works. Okay, intro. But if you want to get take the gloves off and get really into this, you can actually do this. And you have to type in begin unverified Perl, and we actually help you here. So if you double click that, you get begin unverified Perl and end unverified. So this means inside of here, we're no longer checking you for errors. So it's kind of crazy. But you can do stuff like return question name in all caps. Let's see if that works. It does, intro. So same thing as before, but now I'm inside unverified Perl, and I should be able to do something like this. Yo, 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 or something. And here I'm actually just putting, let's see if that works. Okay, I'm putting some custom text on the end of that. You'll see how this is actually useful coming up. But okay, so that's just kind of scratching the surface of what you can do in unverified Perl. One of the common things you might end up doing is if statements, and we'll cover those in a second. And I'm going to make this a bigger screen here. But you can say stuff like, if such and such is true, do this, and then you can do an else statement, and you can say otherwise, do this. And you start to get really powerful stuff that you can do because you're using a very powerful programming language within Lighthouse Studio. Okay.
Justin, quick question.
Yes, go ahead, please.
You mentioned that it is difficult it's called unverified Perl because we can't detect the errors. Do you make any recommendations to people writing unverified Perl to figure out how to check if there are errors, or essentially how to debug them if the code that they've written hasn't worked?
Yeah, we're going to get into that. So we're going to talk about how to write the code, and then we're going to get into how to debug the code.
Perfect.
That is one of the challenges with this. Yep.
Thank you.
So I have a little test demo survey here. You're going to actually get all these demos when you download the material for this webinar. But I'm going to click on test here. So this is just an example of some of the things you can do with unverified Perl. I believe this was an example that a user asked for years ago, and so this is kind of like a real life thing. But they wanted to make it so that, and I'll read this. This is an example of how to ask a follow-up question if the most used product is tied with another product. Items 1 and 2 are excluded from the most used. Okay, so we're going to do this where they use product 4 and 5 the most, and it's tied. They're both use these 4 times. then we'll see that the follow-up is just going to ask them some question about, okay, well, what do you think about 4 versus 5? And it's sophisticated enough to if you do something like that, it will exclude the first 2 rows. So again, it's just customizing things, and it really gives our users almost ultimate power on things that they want to customize and change. And I'm not going to go too far into how I did this yet because we haven't learned it, but if you look into the constructed list on this example, here you see the begin unverified Perl. Note the bracket %'s not there because we're expecting script in this area. And so, we do begin unverified Perl, end unverified Perl, and here's a little bit of custom code that's allowing that custom functionality to happen. Towards the end, we'll maybe come back here and I'll walk you through what that's doing. Okay. Okay, we're going to move on. Okay, so let's just go over some Perl basics, and a lot of this is also in the help. If you go into the help for Lighthouse Studio, you'll be able to search for Perl, and there's a little tutorial on Perl to kind of get up and running with the basics. So we're going to talk about variables and if statements and for loops and functions, etc. So where can you use Perl? Pretty much anywhere you can type in text. So like I said, you can just type it right in there. You can type it in, many of you might not know this, but you can actually type it into your skip logic. You can enter it into, as we saw, the constructed lists. Pretty much anywhere you can type text, you can actually type this unverified Perl. I don't really like calling it unverified Perl. I like just calling it Perl. Here's a little example of some Perl code that you might have in constructed lists. You might say, if the value of Q1 is equal to 5, then I want to do an add if chosen with Q3. Let's start talking about variables. Sure many of you are familiar with what a variable is, but let's go over it. So when I think about a variable, I think about an imaginary box, and inside that box, it can hold something. So it could hold 5, 10, it can hold a number, it can hold 100.6, it could hold the string hello. Variables hold values and they can change, and they're just a little storage container. In Perl, variables start with a $sign. And what's interesting is you'll see the same type of thing in other languages. For instance, jQuery uses the $sign for things. So all Perl variables must be declared using the my keyword. So if I want to declare a variable, I say my and then $days equals 12. My total underscore seconds equals 0. And you can imagine in your mind a box where the name of the box is days and there's 12 inside of it. And you also notice these semicolons at the end of each line. And sometimes people get frustrated because their code blows up because they forgot a semicolon, and yes, you need the semicolon. So you got to be careful when you type in code. Here we say, total seconds is equal to the days multiplied by 24, multiplied by 60, multiplied by 60. This is probably a bad example. You would probably just want to multiply that out in your calculator and type that in. But anyway, that's the idea. So you can do Excel-like stuff. Star is multiply, slash is divide, plus and minus, etc. And then I return the answer at the bottom. Okay. I might cover this later, but let me point this out right now. Because of the way that we've done this, if you just start typing in some unverified Perl right here, if you're familiar with Perl, you might just want to say print hello. And that actually doesn't work because of the way that we've developed this. If you do it like this, right inside of a header 2, for example, you want to actually use return. And I'll just preview that real quick. So you see there it says hello. So the result, instead of printing the result to the screen, you return it. So if you have, we'll get into strings in a second, but you can build up your string and then, or whatever you're doing, you can build it up and then return it to the screen at the end of your code. Okay. So yeah, strings. A string is basically a word. It's a bunch of text. So, you know, variables can store numbers or text, and we call text strings. They typically have double quotes around them. So here's an example of setting up a variable called base name, and then setting equal to quest, and notice it's inside double quotes. If you just typed quest in here without double quotes, there would be a problem and you'd see an error. So here I'm returning this to the screen. I'm saying the result is, and I have double quotes, and I have a colon, and then this dot. What this dot does is it joins things together. So it concatenates this part of the text with this part of whatever you're doing, and it puts it together. So what's happening here is it's grabbing the value from the base name, which is quest. Well, first of all, it builds a string here. It grabs quest, and then this dot is concatenate. It puts on 5 on the end. So in the end, this is going to be quest 5, and then it's asking, what is the value for quest 5? And then it gets that value. It might be 5. It might be the number 7, and then it's going to join. It's going to return the result is 7 when it's all done. Now, I actually showed you this example on purpose because at the very end, I'm going to show you a powerful reason why this is really cool to build question names on the fly. Okay, comments. You might have seen comments in other programming languages. It just allows you to type a little note to yourself. Nobody but you and whoever looks at your code will see it. The end user never sees it. The respondents to your survey will never see it. So here with the hashtag, I'm saying building question names on the fly can be useful, or you can type in whatever you need here to remind yourself what's happening in the code. Okay, so let's talk about arrays. An array is kind of like a variable, but it's more complex. It's a collection of variables. So think about this. I have this picture here of a bunch of rectangles joined together and numbers inside of those. That's how you can imagine what an array is in your mind. That helps me. So it's a list or a collection of variables that kind of is in one container. So here's an example. I have my, and then with arrays, they start with an @ sign. So my @ scores equals, and then inside parentheses, I have a bunch of numbers. So what that does behind the scenes is that makes a storage container, which if you think about rectangles helps me, and it puts 35 in the first container, 57 in the second container, 13 in the third container, and so on. Now something that is tricky with arrays is if you want to get those values out of the array, then you use what's called zero-based indexing. So if you want to get out the first item out of the array, you would think that you would say you would give it a 1 here, but it's actually zero-based. So to get that first value, you actually have to give it a 0. And then this guy is referenced with a 1, 2, and so on. So that can be tricky to get used to. But here, if I want to add up, say, the first 3 values in this array, I then use $scores bracket 0. And it's a little confusing. The @ sign is used when you're storing the whole array. The $sign is used when you're going to grab one value out. And so $scores bracket 0 will give me the 35 plus the item that's referenced with index 1, the second item actually, which is 57, and then 2 will give me the third, and it adds it all together. Okay, so that can be a bit confusing, but these arrays can actually be very helpful when you're dealing with a list of numbers or a list of names or a list of zip codes or something. Okay, let's talk about hashes, and this is a different Perl data structure. A hash is kind of like an array, but the issue with arrays is if you want to look for something, you kind of have to look through everything. You got to look through, let's say you're looking for your socks. You have to look through every single drawer in your dresser for those socks. So if you're looking for, the prior slide, if you're looking for 68, you don't know where it's at. So you have to say, are you 68? Are you 68? Are you 68? You kind of have to walk through it looking for 68. The advantage to a hash is it lets you look up things really quickly with key value pairs. So given a key, you can quickly jump to the value. So hashes in other languages, they're called maps, dictionaries. Here you go, and then you have %, zip codes. This is how you define a hash. And here I'm setting it equal to these parentheses, which is kind of like an empty state. I'm just kind of declaring that there is a hash, but it's empty. Then the next line, I actually assign values to it. So I'm saying zip codes are equal to, in parentheses, and then I set up a list of key value pairs. So on the left, I have the key, which is the zip code. And I chose to put these inside double quotes, so they treat them like as strings. Part of the reason is because some zip codes start with zeros. So here I have 98382 is the key that will give me this name of a town we used to live in called Squim. And if the key is 84049, it will return the string Heber. If the string is 02108, it will return Boston. Okay, the advantage again is the code doesn't have to look through each item searching for Boston. It kind of magically just quickly returns Boston if you give it that special key. So here if I return, and again, if I'm kind of bringing out a single value, I use the $sign. And if I'm storing a collection of things, it's either the @ sign or the % sign. So here, return $zip code, and then it's basically saying search for 84032. Whoop. And it will return the, looks like I have a typo there that I'll have to fix. But it will return the zip code 84032, this 9 should be a 2. It will return Heber to the screen. Okay. Checking to see, this piece of code here will see if this particular zip code exists. So here I'm just saying if I'm gathering the value that they typed in for QZip, and I'm saying, does this zip code exist in the hash? If it exists, then I found it and it's all good. Okay, hashes. So arrays and hashes are kind of complex. Actually, the if statement, maybe I should have shown that first. It's a lot more simple to understand. So an if statement basically just allows you to control the flow of the code. So the code starts at the top and it goes to the bottom. And in this example, it says if the value of Q1 is equal to 1, and by the way, there's 2 equals there. When you use 2 equals, you're making a comparison. This is the same as in other languages. You're asking, is the value of Q1 equal to 1? If you use just a single equal, and this is an important thing to highlight because it's a common mistake. If you used a single equals, it would be putting 1 into the left-hand side. It would be assigning a value. We're not assigning values here. We're just asking the question, is Q1 equal to 1? If it is true, then we run this code, AIC Q3. And then what happens is this is a kind of a cluster of if statements. Then what happens is the code jumps to the very end of the block. But if this is false, it will check the next line of code here, and it will say, okay, is Q1 equal to 2? If it is, do this, and then don't do anything else. So it allows you to selectively run code. Very useful. I would guess in almost every program there are some if statements. Okay, here's an example of using a bunch of if statements. Now, turns out that this example is not good. This is not what I don't want you to do, and that is because of this. If you have kind of a value that is mutually exclusive, so you're basically checking for what the value to Q1 is. So let's look at the first statement. If Q1 is equal to 1, then do add if chosen Q3. So Q1 is 1. We're good, and we're going to run that code. And then it comes here and it says, if Q1 is equal to 2, well, there's no reason to do that because we already know that it's 1. We've already run that code, and this could actually potentially, a bug could crop up here because the code, not only is it not very efficient, I've seen people who their code was running really, really slow, and they had like 1,000 of these if statements where Q1 could only be 1 value, yet they were checking Q1 for a ton of values. So this is inefficient, and it's also introduces the possibility of bugs. So I'm going to show you a better way. So on the next screen, I'm just going to say, don't do this. Do not do this. And I'm stressing this because I've seen it with countless users. They want to just write a bunch of if statements. What you want to do is if you only have, there's only 1 value to Q1, and you have a list of things here, you want to do else ifs. It's kind of strange in JavaScript. They actually spell it right and have a space. In Perl, it's 1 word, and it's just saying else if. So if Q1 is equal to 1, great, we go in here and do this code. If it's false, we then check this one. Okay, otherwise, let's check this one. But if it's true, the code will skip all the way to the bottom of this kind of cluster of statements, and we're on our way. So that's really nice. It's going to get in, do its job, and get out. It's not going to sit there and say, well, what if it's 2? Well, it's not 2. We already saw that it was 1, and we're done, right? So please use this pattern instead of a boatload of if statements. Okay, here, these again are things that, some of them are things that are applied to many programming languages, including JavaScript, C++, and things like that. So as you're building logic here, you're saying if this is equal to this and this is greater than this, or yada, yada, yada. Ampersand is for and. These up pipe characters are for or. 2 equals represents, comparing numerical values. And an exclamation point equal is for, not equal. The thing that, then we have, greater than, less than, and you can do less than or equal or greater than or equal. I'm sure you're familiar with those. The thing that's kind of tricky about Perl is if you want to compare 2 strings, 2 pieces of text, you can't use equal equal, you have to use EQ, and that can be tricky. But just remember, if you wanted to compare strings or text, you use EQ, and NE stands for not equal, but when you're comparing numbers, which you do most of the time, then you do equal equal. So here's an example where it's saying if the value to Q1 is equal to 3, if it's equal to 3, we're not assigning it, we're just asking the question, and the value to Q2 is greater than 4, or the value to Q2 is less than 100, and you notice I can do parentheses. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this kind of logic in Excel. Very similar. If all that's true, then it executes that statement. Okay, let's talk about for loops. So if statements allow you to kind of control flow, only executing the line of code that is appropriate. For loops actually allow you to call the code over and over again. It allows you to repeat the code for a set number of times. So here's an example. My numQuest, this is a variable like a box, I'm putting 50 in it. I'm creating another box, variable total, putting zeros in, I'm just declaring these variable. And then what happens, and this is, I remember learning this for the first time myself, it's kind of involved here, so you kind of have to digest it a little bit. This first thing here initializes what we call the kind of the counter variable. And a lot of times I is used for iterator. So $I is equal to 1, and that's how it initializes it. Then it asks, is 1 less than or equal to the number of questions, which is 50? So we're saying, is 1 less than or equal to 50? It is. Then let's run this code. This code total starts out at 0, and let's add the value, and this will look in the database for, and here's a very useful thing. it will look in the database for Q and then a dot because we're concatenating strings, and then $I, which is 1. It will say, give me the value for Q1. It then adds the value to Q1 to total, and then it puts it into total. So now, let's say Q1 was 5. We're going to have 5 into total. It then hits this closing curly brace, and it comes up to here, this last statement, and it says, okay, let's increment 1. So now 1 is 2. Plus plus just adds 1 to it. So now we have 2. And then it asks, is 2 less than or equal to 50? It is. Let's run this code again. Now total has 5 in it, and then Q, and now $I is 2. So now we're getting the value of Q2, and we're adding it to 5 and putting its total in total. Let's say that Q2 was also 5. Well, it's 5 plus 5. Now we got 10. And it keeps going. So that's a way that you can walk through, say, all their answers and add them up, for instance, or do many other things. It's a way to loop code. Okay. For each is actually a bit simpler of a type of a loop. You could have a scores array, for instance, in this example. And then we're just saying for each. So we put the array here in parentheses, and then we're saying for each item in the scores array, put each item into this variable single score. So the first time it's going to put in 55, and then it's going to take the total plus 55 and put that into total score. And then it's going to loop around and get the next item in the score. So this just says for each item in the array, loop around and put each item, sequentially into single score. Megan, do you have any questions? Does this make sense?
Yeah, making sense so far.
I just need a break. Water here.
Nope, you're doing great explaining it. For loops are tricky to try to foresee how to write them appropriately.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of syntax and semicolons, and it did take me a while to get. Now I'm good at it, but it took a while to kind of understand those. And for each is a little bit simpler. And you might be asking yourself, why on earth would I ever use a loop? And we'll see some of that in the examples at the end. Okay, we're almost done with showing the syntax. Functions. Functions are very useful for allowing you to package up some code and then use it over and over again. It's a way to reuse code. So here's an example. Functions are kind of silly, kind of funny, kind of different in Perl than in other languages. Instead of typing function here, you type in sub, and it stands for subroutine, but it's a function. Sub, and then the name of the function, and then you do curly braces. This is the part that's most funny. Most of the time, if you want to give your function some input, you would do parentheses after add nums. But in Perl, you do this crazy line. And what this line of code does is essentially saying when someone calls add nums, they can pass in these two numbers into the code. So here's where we define the function sub add nums, and the code basically looks at this and remembers it, but it doesn't run it. Then down here where it says return add nums, that's when it actually runs the code. So this is calling, up here is defining the function, and down below is actually running it or calling it. So I'm going to call add nums, and I'm going to give it a 4 and a 5. Then what happens is the flow of the code comes up here to add nums, and it passes into this variable num1, it will pass in the 4. For num2, it will pass in the 5. It then adds them together, puts it in the sum here, and returns the sum. Okay, so that's how functions work. You might not ever use a function, but you need to know, it's nice to know if they exist. Okay, looks like I need to maybe get going through some of these slides a little faster. There is a way, and this is actually not unverified Perl. This is back to Sawtooth script, but just to highlight the ability to save variables and retrieve variables, to be able to save things to the database and retrieve them from the database. And we use this just with regular Sawtooth script with set value, And the very first thing is, what do you want to save? What's the name of the variable you want to save, and what's the value? And then this is how you get that value back out. And I'll show you that in my examples. Debugging. So that was a question asked at the very beginning. We'll show that. But if you have an error, you're running. Let's try and see if this works. So if you put in, if you're putting in some code here, and you want to return hello, okay, there's a problem here. Well, I guess I won't tell you the problem. Maybe you know it. There's a problem here in my code. I'm actually going to run this survey. And you can see that there's a problem. Sawtooth error 132, script error. And it won't give you any details here about what the problem is. Well, you can actually get to that if you go into, since I was testing, I can go into the admin module here, and I can see that there's an error log, and I can view the error log, and I can see here that there's a problem. And it's craziness, but it kind of talks about what time, what date it happened, what time it happened, and then it message. There's an error in the Lighthouse scripting, and then it gives the script here, return hello, and then it says, bare word hello, not allowed while strict. So it's going to be kind of hard to figure out what the problem is, but it basically is not liking the fact that I didn't put double quotes around it. Okay, so that's an example of if there's a problem, you can look in the error log and you can see what the problem might be. This is going to be a good first step. Okay. So debugging also, you might have 100 lines of code and you're just so confused about where the problem could be. Well, my advice is to simplify. So if you have a bunch of code, let's look at this. You don't know where the problem is. Well, what you do is you can comment out code. So you might just temporarily put a hashtag, and this is kind of painful, but put a hashtag in front of every line, right? So that you can take that out of consideration and see what's happening right here. You might be able to return that to the screen and say, okay, let's return num items right here, because I want to make sure I understand what the value is at this point. Okay, that works. Now let's comment out this and let's see what the value is at this point. So that's the way you can kind of dig in, and you can if you're searching for a needle in a haystack, you could divide the haystack in half, burn it, and see if the needle was there. And that's the kind of thing, is you're kind of breaking down the problem to see where the problem lies. It's really bad to say, there's a problem, I don't know where it is, can you help me? There's 100 billion lines of code, there's a problem, just help me. No, you need to kind of divide it down and find on what line is it actually blowing up. Okay. This can be actually pretty useful here. And I believe in one of my examples I have this. This is kind of a trick here where I've created a function debug message that you can actually use, and then you can call it wherever you're having problems. You can call debug message, and it will print out to this file whatever the value was at that point in the code. So this is actually a really useful slide, kind of a built-in way to better debug your code, and I'll show that in my example. Okay, we're to the demo. So, Megan, do we have any questions at all, or do we want to go into the demo?
Yeah, just a quick one on slide 22, I believe it was, or slide 20. When you reference the zip codes, I know a lot of customers out there typically verify their respondents are located in a certain zip code, so maybe there's not necessarily a city attached to the code. They just have a list of codes. And somebody wrote in asking if there is a way you can search an entire array the same as you're doing this hash.
Okay, so yeah, so I probably didn't do a great example here, but if you wanted just to see if that zip code existed, you don't care about returning the city name. You just want to know if it exists. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Right. So I would still use a hash because I wouldn't want to have to look through 100 zip codes in an array. I would just want to ask the question, does this zip code exist? When that happens, and I do that a whole lot in my coding, I would just put a 1 here. And so instead of Squim, Heber, and Boston, I would just put a 1. Just any value. You exist. 1, 1, 1, 1. And then what I do is the exact same thing down here. See, in fact, this is the exact answer. In this example where I say if exists, I'm actually not using Squim, Heber, or Boston. I'm just saying, does this exist? So you could do exactly what you wanted to do and just put 1s in there.
Great. Thank you.
That's a good segue into, let's look at one of these examples. So I'm going to give you four different sample surveys, and I will just close this one really quick. Okay, and this example has the zip code example in it, and let's run it. I'm using some pass-in variables, and I'll show you why I'm doing that in a second, but I'm just going to leave them empty. Okay, so let's say I enter in the zip code 12345, and I click next. That is not a valid zip code, and I'm skipped to the end. Okay. Okay, but now if I do 84032, now everybody knows my zip code, and you click on next, that will let you in the survey. How did I do that? So if you look at the zip code question, there is some skip logic. And inside the skip logic, it's nasty in this little thing, but if you click on the pencil icon, you can see that I actually have some unverified Perl code in here that is exactly what we just talked about. It sets up a list of valid zip codes, and I just put a 1 here because it really doesn't matter the value. What matters is the key, and I do this all the time. And I'm just saying if, and this value is grabbing the value they typed in, and then it's saying, does that value exist in the hash? If it does exist, return 0, which means don't skip. If it returns a 1, it means skip. And I've defined out here where I'm skipping to. I'm skipping to the disqualified question. So returning 1 skips, 0 doesn't skip, and that's how I do it. And that is a very efficient way. And I don't know how many zip codes you're dealing with, but you know, if you had 300 zip codes, this would be the right way to look it up quickly and be able to say they're in or out of the survey. Okay. This is another kind of arbitrary example here. What I do is I say, okay, if they enter in a score above 50, then this item will appear on the next screen. So I'm going to put like 5 in for this guy, but I'm going to put 80 in for this one, maybe 30 in for this one, and 65 in for that one. So what happens is I get a follow-up select question on the items that I scored higher than 50, right? 2 and 4. But if I did like 4 here and did, 54 here, then I would get 1 and 4. How do I do that? Well, there's a question called select items, and it has a list called high item list. It's a constructed list. And if you look in the list manager area, the constructed list high item list has a bunch of unverified Perl. Let's look at this code. So the first thing I'm doing here is setting up a variable called I, and then another variable called int total. And this basically is just hard-coded the number of boxes I had on my screen. I had four input boxes. Here's an example of a for loop. I want to walk through every single box on that screen, and I want to ask the question, is the value they typed in for that question greater than 50? If it is greater than 50, I want to add it to my list. Okay, so here's that kind of complex for loop. What I do is I start out with 1. I make sure that 1 is less than or equal to the total, which I've said was 4. And then here's a comment. Super useful concept. And that is, instead of typing in what's the score for score 1, kind of manually hard coding that in there, it's more dynamic. I'm saying, what is the score? And then on the fly, I'm saying, what is the score for score plus 1? Concatenate 1. What's the score for score 1? If it's greater than 50, do this. Then I'll show you this in a second. I'm debugging out a message. Then it's looping back around and it's incrementing here. It's incrementing 1 to 2. And then here it says, what's the score for 2? Loop around. What's the score for 3? Okay. If you had 100 scores you had to check, doing it in the loop is the only way to fly, because typing this all out would take forever. So loops can be very helpful. This is an awesome thing here, this little debug message. I'm wanting to print out to a file the value of I at this point in the code. So you can just use this example and copy and paste this debug function into your code and do the same thing. So what happens is I'm calling a function, it's passing in this value into here, and then it's opening up a file and it's putting that value in the file and closing it. By the way, it also puts in the time. Okay. So when I run this survey, I can go into the Files button here, and when I test a survey, it's all contained in this test survey folder, and I chose to put that little file inside of the admin folder, and you'll see my little debug.txt. So if you click on it, this will show you what the loop item value was on each iteration of the loop. This is very helpful when you're debugging. So you can actually put this little function call at any point in the code where you want to know what the value is to try to figure out what's going on. You can put that in there to debug. Very helpful. Oh, we're running out of time. Darn it. Okay, so let me show you, let's see here. I showed you the cool things about the Perl. Let me show you list 2. Okay, in this example, let's run it. We have a list. We have a list here of sit-down restaurants and a list of fast foods, and then it combines here. Which is your favorite? And then this is going to take a second for you to process, but this is also an example from a real customer with the names changed years ago. And what it will do is they had some very specific needs here for this grid question. And here are the needs listed below. In the end, we want to come up with 3 hotels. We're going to give Embassy Suites and La Quinta, priority. So if they select they're very familiar, somewhat familiar, or no name only, then they get priority over the other hotels. But the other hotels are filled with preference given to those that are most familiar first. Even if there is ever a tie, then it randomizes. Okay? So let's say that we are very familiar with everything. Then what, according to these rules, what it's going to do is come back with our Embassy Suites and La Quinta. Okay? So Embassy Suites and La Quinta are in there, and the Nights Inn was chosen randomly. Okay, but if, let's say I'm not familiar with any of these guys, but I'm very familiar actually with Days and very familiar with Red Roof, but only know the name of La Quinta, but I'm also, very familiar with some of these guys. So this is just going to show that it's going to give La Quinta priority because I know name only, it's going to give it priority. And so La Quinta came in, okay? So this is actually a fairly complex constructed list that I want to show you. So I'm going to come back into the list logic, and I think I'm going to go here to a 3 list. I only have a few minutes, so it's pretty intense. But what I'm going to do is I have a familiar 1 list, a familiar 2 list, and a familiar 3 list. These are all done with regular scripting. So what this does is it will add all the items that where they're very familiar with it. This then adds all the items that they were somewhat familiar with. This adds all the items that they were very familiar with. Then what I do here is I add all those to my list in priority. Okay. Then I have to do a little bit of unverified Perl. And I'm saying if the list has Embassy Suites in it, then promote it. Put it into the first position. If it has La Quinta in it, put it in its first position. And then we add one more here, and then at the end we chop it off with the top 3. So just using some unverified Perl, we're able to give priority to these 2 hotels. Are there any questions, Megan?
Nope.
I'm going to finish with a final example if there's nothing.
Nope, I think that was a good example. And just a note that typically you are going to have to tell the software that you're using unverified Perl. This was a question that was written in. So you can see Justin's text there. But you can see the automatic scripting that's above that doesn't need the text of unverified Perl. So
Sawtooth script.
Right, right. So for the most part, 90% of the time, if you're going to be bringing in Perl language, you should be using the begin unverified Perl. Would that be a correct statement?
Yeah, it's all Perl behind the scenes.
Right.
But you could kind of say that this right here is Sawtooth script.
Right.
And you could say that this right here is you're going custom Perl.
Custom. Thank you.
And you can kind of use them interchangeably like I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Let me show you another example that's pretty fancy. And it only uses a teeny bit of unverified Perl, but hey, it's cool. So, and this is the MVC example. I actually showed this in the JavaScript tutorial because it also uses JavaScript, and all these things can mix and match and help you out here. Here's an example of where I'm actually doing an MVC exercise. Now we sell MVC analysis, but we don't have anything built in that will run an MVC survey for you. So I'm actually using free format to do that. And I'm using a CBC design to feed into my MVC. And I'm also using looping to basically, and this is just built-in looping, this button here, it's built-in looping to do this. So the free format, this is much better than having, say, 10 free format questions. To loop a free format question allows you to only have to edit 1 question. And Megan has expressed to me that this is really cool. So if you just run this survey, you can see here that I have a task here, and I'm able to configure the options for a car. When I click next, it actually loops back around and shows me this question again with a different design. And in this way, I'm able to have a custom MVC exercise with only having to write 1 free format question. Now this fancy, checking, having the total update, that's all done with JavaScript. And if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to check it out. We covered that in the first part of this series. But here's the little itsy bitsy unverified Perl trick that really helps here. Sorry. If you look into this free format question, into the variables, and you blow this up, there's 1 free format question that's bringing in different designs. And right in here, I'm using unverified Perl. And the only reason I'm using it is so I can build the design value on the fly. So I'm calling CBC design level text. Go get the text for this CBC design, and it expects the name of the input to be the question name 1, 2, or 3. And so here's model 1 random, and instead of hard coding in a 1, I actually concatenate the loop value, which turns out to be 1 the first time, right? 1 the first time, next time around it's going to be 2, next time around it's going to be 3, and that's what allows me to bring in the designs all on the fly and only have to use 1 free format question to do that. I've gone over time. Sorry, but that's it.
That's all right, because that last point, like Justin said, is really cool, but also an incredible time saver as well. Last question that came in from one of our friends is to talk about the way that you should try to configure how you're using each of these tools. So Justin, would you recommend always using what we call SSI script first, and then followed by writing some unverified Perl, then followed
Yes.
by JavaScript and jQuery? Is that how you would proceed as well?
Well, JavaScript and jQuery are used for different purposes.
True.
Sometimes you can do the same. You can solve the same problem with different languages. That can happen, but sometimes you just flat out have to use JavaScript in some situations, and using Perl wouldn't be appropriate. But definitely use Sawtooth script first, because the Perl is like, fancier Sawtooth script. So try and see if you can do it with just regular Sawtooth script. If you can't, if you run into a need for an if statement or something like a loop, then you have to use unverified Perl. Yeah, there are some situations where, JavaScript actually will accomplish will solve some of the problems that you're trying to do in Perl. You could do in JavaScript, but that's not always the case. If you think about the first part of the slides, you have to remember where things are running. And if you need things done up on the server, then use Perl. If you need things done down on the browser, then use JavaScript.
Perfect. Thank you. And as always, anytime you're writing custom code, check your survey yourself. You may not find an error, but maybe in that last free format example, your end task was 10, your client decided to increase your number of tasks to 12, and you didn't update it, and now you're not asking about all 12. There's a lot of ways that things can get a little bit iffy when you're writing custom code. So always check your work.
Absolutely. You really have to test it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And thank you, Justin, for this webinar. And thank you to all of our suite holders for joining us. You will receive a copy of the webinar and a recording as soon as possible. We hope to see you at the next webinar.